He was an ordinary rancher fighting for the survival of his farm until he stumbled upon a rusty chain sticking out of the ground. He started digging and found a chest that held the truth that would change his life and the fate of the entire region. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new incredible stories, and write in the comments which city you're from. The first light of dawn stretched pale and silver across the open prairie when Garrett Johnson stepped out of his weathered ranch house and into the brittle chill of early spring. His boots sank slightly into the cold soil, still stiff from the night frost, and his breath hung in the air for a moment before dissolving into nothing. The horizon rolled wide and empty around him, a sea of dry grass and scattered mesquite, broken only by the distant, low shape of the hills and the fence lines he had built and rebuilt 100 times. The world here was quiet in the way only the plains could be, vast, unhurried, and a little lonely. Garrett paused on the porch, one hand resting on the rough railing his father had hammered together decades ago, and let his eyes travel across the land that had shaped every year of his life. It was his, and yet lately it felt like something slipping through his fingers. He had been born on this very ground when the Civil War was still a fresh memory, and the railroad had only just begun to carve its way across the frontier. His father had driven cattle through storms and droughts to hold this place together. His mother had kept the small house alive with warmth and hard work, raising her children to endure. Garrett had grown up chasing stray calves, mending fences until his hands were a map of calluses, and sleeping under a roof that rattled in every gust of wind. He had watched the railroad push west and towns rise and fall, but the ranch had stayed. Through wars, through panics and lean seasons, through the death of his parents and the long, lonely years after, the land remained. And yet, for the first time in his life, Garrett wondered how much longer he could hold it. The cattle business was no longer what it had been. Rustlers and drought had taken their share. Disease had swept through his herd 2 winters ago and left him with less than half the stock he once drove to market. Prices had fallen, and buyers from the east haggled harder every year. Repairs cost money he did not have. The barn roof sagged, the north fence was half collapsed, and the well pump groaned each time he worked the handle. He owed more than he wanted to admit to the man who ran the only bank in the nearby town. Each month, the interest climbed like a weed he could not pull. His hands were still strong, his back still willing, but strength and will could not pay debts or bring rain. At night, he sat at the scarred kitchen table, a lantern throwing its soft yellow light across unpaid notes, and tried to calculate a way out. Always, he came back to the same cold truth. There was none. Garrett was a man of few words. In the town 10 miles down the dirt road, people knew him as hard-working, but distant. He came in for feed, salt, and mail, tipped his hat, and left. At the saloon, he kept to a corner with his drink, listening more than speaking, while the younger men laughed and swapped stories. The sheriff respected him, but rarely visited. The newspaper man nodded politely, but never lingered. Garrett was tolerated, perhaps even admired quietly for his perseverance, yet he was alone. Since his wife Mary had passed nearly 10 years ago after a fever took her in a single terrible week, the ranch had been silent except for the lowing of cattle and the whistle of wind through dry grass. His 2 sons had gone east as soon as they were grown. The eldest had taken work with the railroads. The younger had found his way to law and business in some bustling city. They wrote now and then, polite letters full of news about offices and trains and wives Garrett had never met, but neither planned to return. They had been frank the last time they visited. Ranching was a dead end. Too much sweat. Too little reward. No future. Garrett had said little then. Inside, he had understood. But understanding did not dull the ache. Every day he rose before the sun, because that was what his father had done and what the land required. He saddled his horse or hitched his pair of tired mules to the old plow when feed was scarce and buying a machine was out of reach. He checked the fences, counted the cattle, hauled water. He ate cold biscuits in the saddle and mended leather by lantern light at night. There was a rhythm to it, a hard, unchanging rhythm that had been his life for more than 5 decades. But lately, as he rode the boundaries of his land, he felt something heavier than the usual fatigue. It was the weight of futility, of fighting a losing battle against drought, debt, and time itself. The ranch was not just work, it was the last thread binding him to his parents, to Mary, to the boys who had once ridden alongside him. To give it up would be like letting go of them too. And yet he feared the day might come when he had no choice. He thought often of his father in these silent rides. The old man had been stern but fair, with a back like a tree trunk and hands that seemed carved from oak. He had built this ranch out of nothing but grit, and he had taught Garrett to respect the land above all. "This earth remembers, boy," his father had said, more times than Garrett could count. "It keeps the story of every man who works it. Don't ever forget you're just adding your name to something older." Back then, those words had felt like a kind of blessing. Now they felt heavier, almost like a warning. What would the land remember of him? A man who tried and failed. That spring, a stubborn idea took root in his mind. If he could open up a stretch of ground he had never used, maybe he could plant better feed for the cattle and avoid another costly trip to buy hay. There was a broad, neglected section beyond the north fence, rough and patchy, that his father had never plowed. He had asked about it once as a boy and been told only that the soil was poor and the place unlucky. Garrett had never questioned the answer until now. He needed every inch he could work, and superstitions would not pay the bank. So one morning he hitched the mules, sharpened the worn iron of his plow as best he could, and set off toward the forgotten field. The land there was uneven, the grass dry and brittle from years of neglect. Mesquite roots twisted through the ground, making the plow jump and rattle as the mules strained forward. Garrett's arms ached as he guided the handles, sweat dampening his shirt even in the cool morning air. Slowly, row by row, he turned the earth that had not been broken in decades, dark soil curling up from beneath the sun-bleached crust. For a time the work was almost soothing, the steady creak of harness and the grunt of the mules drowning out the gnawing worry in his head. Then, near midday, the plow shuddered and came to an abrupt stop. The mules jerked against their traces, snorting in protest. Garrett stumbled forward, catching himself on the handles, and muttered under his breath. He had struck roots before, and rocks, but this felt different, a sudden, stubborn resistance that would not give. He unhitched the animals and knelt to inspect the furrow. There, just under the churned soil, something metallic caught the sunlight. At first he thought it an old piece of broken harness or discarded tool, but when he brushed away more dirt with his gloved hand, he saw the heavy, rusted curve of a chain link. He frowned and tugged at it, expecting it to pull free easily if it were just scrap. Instead, the chain held fast, vanishing into the earth like a snake. He dug more, exposing several thick, corroded links, each one fused with soil and age. They led downward, deeper than he could reach with his hand. An old farm implement, perhaps? But why would anyone bury a chain so deliberately? He stood, dusting his knees, and looked out across the empty field. There was no sign of anything man-made, no stump, no fence post that would have needed anchoring. Just the endless grass and the distant line of hills. Curiosity stirred in him despite the fatigue. He could have marked the spot and returned later, but something about the way the chain disappeared into the earth unsettled him. It was as though the land itself were holding tight to a secret. He retrieved the small spade from the wagon and began to dig, loosening the packed soil around the chain. Each shovelful revealed more links, twisted and crusted with rust, stretching deeper than he expected. Sweat beaded on his brow, the sun climbing higher and hotter. Still he worked, driven by a strange insistence he could not explain. The mules dozed in the traces, tails flicking at flies as their master dug on. Hours passed. The hole widened and deepened until Garrett's shoulders ached, and his hands were raw inside his gloves. And then his spade struck something solid, not stone, but wood, with a dull, hollow sound that made him freeze. Slowly, carefully, he brushed the dirt away. A corner emerged, then an edge, the dark grain swollen and softened by years beneath the ground. It was a box or chest of some kind, large enough to fill the bottom of the hole, its surface bound with iron straps now mottled orange with rust. The chain he had followed was bolted to a ring set in the lid, as though someone had once used it to drag or secure the thing before burying it. Garrett crouched there, breathing hard, staring at the half-revealed chest. His first thought was practical old tools, maybe, or supplies hidden away by his father or grandfather and forgotten. But something in the craftsmanship felt older than the ranch itself, older than his family's time on this land. The wood was blackened with age. The iron was hand-forged, not the kind of hardware sold in the town store. A strange unease prickled at the back of his neck. He rested a calloused hand on the lid, feeling the brittle surface flake slightly under his touch. Whatever this was, it had lain undisturbed for decades, maybe longer. He hesitated only a moment longer before setting the spade's edge into the seam of the lid and prying. The wood groaned but did not give. He worked slowly, levering and wedging, until at last the top cracked and splintered under the pressure. A sharp, dry scent of earth and rust rose up as he pushed it open. Inside, shadows pooled, and at first he could make out nothing but the vague shapes of debris. Then his eyes adjusted. Iron. Cold. Corroded iron. Shackles, several pairs twisted together in a heap, their curved bands unmistakable even in ruin. Smaller lengths of chain coiled among them, the links fused with rust. A rag of cloth clung to one corner, discolored and fragile as dried leaves. Beneath it, bundles of paper wrapped long ago in what had once been oiled cloth, now cracked and crumbling with age. For a long time Garrett did not move. The prairie was silent around him, the only sound his own uneven breathing. He reached in, almost unwillingly, and lifted one of the shackles. It was heavier than he expected, the iron cold despite the sun's heat, its inner curve shaped cruelly to close around a wrist or ankle. A chill passed through him that had nothing to do with the breeze. He let it drop back into the chest, where it landed with a muted metallic clank that echoed in the hollow pit. He sat back on his heels, staring down at the trove. This was no farmer's cache, no forgotten equipment. Whatever he had unearthed was older, darker, a secret the land had kept long before his family claimed it. He did not yet know what it meant, but deep inside he felt the weight of it settle over him like a shadow. His father's words returned unbidden. The earth remembers. Perhaps it remembered things he had never imagined. The sun was sliding toward the western hills now, long rays painting the prairie gold. Garrett climbed slowly out of the hole, every muscle aching from the day's labor, and stood for a long time, looking at the broken ground and the chest resting within it. He felt strangely small, a solitary man on a vast and ancient land that had just spoken in a voice of iron and dust. He did not know what to do next, but he knew, with an unease that bordered on fear, that nothing on this ranch would ever feel the same again. When night fell on the prairie, Garrett worked by lantern light, finishing the task that the fading sun had forced him to pause. He had thrown a canvas tarp over the half-buried chest and trudged back to the house at dusk. But sleep had not come to him once he reached his bed. The shape of the thing haunted him as he lay in the dark, the way the chain had led him to it, like a silent guide, the weight of the shackle in his hand. He rose long before dawn, lit the old kerosene lamp on the kitchen table, and stood staring out into the blackness beyond the porch. The night was sharp and windless, stars hard and bright overhead, and in the silence he felt the land watching him, waiting. By the time the horizon softened with the first hint of gray, he had saddled his mare and was riding back toward the field. The chest lay where he had left it, half emerged from the raw wound he had dug in the earth. A thin veil of frost sparkled on its cracked wood. Garrett hitched the mare nearby and set to work with numb hands, widening the pit until he could drag the box clear. It was heavier than he expected. When he finally hauled it up, muscles straining, the wood groaned but held. It must have lain sealed for decades, maybe longer, preserved by the dry soil and its own iron bones. He stood panting for a long moment, hands braced on his knees, before straightening and wiping his brow. The chest looked ancient and patient, like something that had waited for him alone to bring it back into the light. He pried the lid the rest of the way open, working more carefully now, determined not to damage what it contained. As daylight strengthened, he could see the interior more clearly than he had the night before. The shackles were unmistakable, thick bands for wrists and ankles, some still joined by short lengths of chain. Smaller links lay in rust-fused coils. A strip of dark, brittle cloth clung to the corner, as though someone had once wrapped it around themselves and left only this remnant behind. Beneath it all were the bundles of paper he had glimpsed, dozens of them, wrapped long ago in oiled cloth, now cracked like old paint. He brushed away dirt with the gentleness one gives to fragile relics, and then, almost without breathing, lifted the first bundle out. Back in the house, he set the chest on the kitchen table and fed the lantern with fresh oil. The smell of rust and earth filled the room as he carefully unwrapped the papers. The oiled cloth peeled back in stiff flakes, revealing pages yellowed to a deep brown at the edges, but still whole. Names filled the first sheets, written in a flowing hand, with ink, now faded but legible. Next to each name were notes, dates, numbers, words like sold, taken, caught. Some were crossed through. Some had arrows pointing to other lines. Garrett's mouth went dry as he turned one page after another, realizing what he held. These were people reduced to inventory men, women, and children listed as if they were cattle. His fingers trembled as he traced the neat columns, feeling the weight of each vanished life. Further down, he found something different. Loose sheets, written in a hurried, slanted hand, not neat like the lists. He held one close to the lamp and read of men hunting with hounds, of frightened families slipping away under cover of darkness, of secret shelters where food and water could be found. There were directions, landmarks, distances, instructions, meant for someone desperate and running. He read of faith and fear, of danger from patrols and bounty hunters, of hope in the face of chains. No names signed the letters, only initials or nothing at all. Whoever wrote them had feared discovery, yet left this behind anyway. Garrett felt a coldness seep through him, not from the prairie wind, but from the knowledge that the soil beneath his boots had once hidden this struggle for life and freedom. He pushed the papers gently aside and reached again for one of the shackles. The iron was rough with rust, but when he turned it in his hands, he could still feel the precision of its shape, the cruel arc designed to close around living flesh. He imagined the weight of it dragging on a wrist, the clink of chains in the night, the breath of someone hiding in terror only yards from where he now sat. He had thought his life hard, his debts crushing, but this was a different kind of hardship, one that stole breath and dignity and left only the hope of escape. He set the shackle down abruptly as if it burned him, and pressed the heels of his hands to his eyes. As daylight brightened the kitchen window, Garrett remained seated at the table, surrounded by relics that were more than relics. They were voices, silent but insistent, from a past the land had chosen to remember. He had never sought to be part of history, never asked for this burden, but now it sat before him undeniable. His father's words echoed with new force. The earth remembers. Perhaps the old man had known something, or perhaps not. Garrett could not ask. He felt both connected and suddenly estranged from the generations before him, as if they had lived over a hidden grave they chose not to disturb. For 2 days he told no one. He went about his chores mechanically, feeding the cattle, mending a section of fence, riding the north line with his rifle across his lap, though his thoughts were far from the herd. At night he returned to the kitchen, lit the lamp, and read through the brittle papers again and again until the words blurred with fatigue. Each time he tried to sleep, the chain seemed to rattle faintly in the silence, echoing in his mind. He considered burying it all back where he'd found it, covering the chest, and forgetting the strange discovery. But the idea filled him with shame. Forgetting would be another kind of betrayal. Yet he feared what would come if the story left his walls. The town was small and tight-knit, bound by pride, and wary of outsiders. There were men there who would call this nothing but trouble, who would rather leave the past unspoken. Garrett had seen their kind before, men who hated having old wounds reopened, who would see any attention from the East as an insult. Still, the truth weighed on him. To keep silent felt like cowardice. He was not the only one who knew something had been uncovered. A passing cowhand had seen the raw earth and the chain still lying in the field before Garrett could finish his work. Word had a way of spreading faster than wind across the prairie. A week after the discovery, a short note appeared in the small-town paper. Local rancher unearths curious artifacts on his land, rumored to be relics of the old days. No details, just enough to spark curiosity. When Garrett rode in for supplies, he felt eyes on him, heard whispers. A man in the saloon asked casually what he'd dug up, and when Garrett said nothing, the man grinned and walked away shaking his head. By the second week, curiosity turned to intrusion. One morning he looked up from watering the stock to see 2 strangers riding slowly up the lane, a thin man with a scholarly air and spectacles that glinted in the sun, and a broad-shouldered preacher wearing a black coat dusty from the trail. They introduced themselves politely, saying they'd heard from the newspaper about his find and were traveling the region to study and preserve history of the Underground Railroad and those who had fled slavery. The words felt strange and heavy in the open air of the ranch yard. Garrett stood silent for a long time, hat in hand, weighing their earnest expressions. Finally, without speaking, he motioned for them to follow. Inside the dim kitchen, the strangers examined the chest with a reverence that unsettled Garrett. The scholar bent close, whispering over the inked names, his hands careful not to damage the fragile pages. The preacher stood quiet, but solemn, as though in prayer, eyes closed for a long moment as his fingers hovered above the shackles without touching. They asked questions when he'd found it, how deep it had been buried, whether there were landmarks nearby. Garrett answered in his quiet way, each word costing him effort. When the preacher spoke of sacred ground and memory, Garrett looked away, feeling exposed in his own house. They left him with their thanks and promises to return with others, historians, churchmen, perhaps benefactors, who could help protect the site. Garrett watched them ride off down the lane, their figures shrinking against the endless grass, and felt a knot form in his stomach. The chest no longer seemed his alone. Its story was slipping away, claimed by forces beyond his understanding. He had only wanted to find pasture. Instead, he had opened a door that could not easily be closed. In the following days, more visitors came, some well-meaning, some only curious. A photographer from a larger town arrived in a rattling wagon, asking to take pictures of the chest and the man who found it. Garrett refused to pose, but the man photographed the box anyway, setting up his tripod in the yard, while Garrett stood scowling on the porch. A traveling writer passed through, asking to hear the whole tale. When Garrett said little, the man left with irritation, promising to write what he could anyway. Each arrival chipped away at the isolation that had defined Garrett's life. Strangers now rode through his gates without invitation, drawn by a story he had never intended to tell. At night, the prairie no longer felt as quiet. Garrett would step onto the porch with his lantern and see distant riders silhouetted against the stars, heading somewhere, but slowing as they passed his boundary. He could feel curiosity pressing in, a force larger than his fences or his silence. In town, some men treated him with sudden warmth, eager to bask in what they called notoriety. Others were colder than before. He overheard one say that stirring up the past would only bring trouble. Another muttered that the East would use this to shame the territory. Through it all, Garrett felt a restless unease he could not shake. The land he had loved and fought to keep was no longer just his. The chest on his table had changed everything. It was not only an artifact, it was a message, a reckoning pulled from the soil itself. He did not know what the future would bring, but he understood one thing with growing clarity. The quiet life he had built, the solitary rhythm of cattle and fences and seasons, had ended the day his plow struck the chain. The weeks that followed the arrival of the first strangers altered Garrett Johnson's world in ways he had never imagined. His ranch, long forgotten by everyone but himself and the occasional trader passing by, had become a name people whispered with curiosity or disdain. The chest on his kitchen table had turned his quiet life into something public and fragile, and each sunrise seemed to bring new faces, new opinions, and new troubles carried on the wide prairie wind. At first, it was only a few more riders, men who looked like teachers or preachers, sometimes with wives who held notebooks and spoke with earnest northern voices. They arrived polite but persistent, asking to see the box, to copy down the names, to measure the depth of the pit where it had lain. Garrett, uncomfortable but still unsure what was right, allowed them into his kitchen and stood silent as they marveled over the papers and the chains. They handled the objects with care, but their voices carried an eagerness that unsettled him. To them, the chest was a discovery, a piece of history to study and publish. To Garrett, it felt heavier, older, and alive in a way they could not sense. They left behind notes and letters promising to return, and with each visitor, he felt the walls of his solitude shrink. Then came the townsfolk. The small article in the paper had grown into talk that spread through the saloon and the general store. When Garrett rode in for feed, the air around him seemed to change. Some greeted him with a kind of new respect, nodding more deeply than before, calling him Mr. Johnson instead of just Garrett. Others turned away or gave him narrow, measuring looks. In the corner of the saloon, he caught fragments of conversation. He dug up trouble. Best to leave that buried. Outsiders will swarm. He had always been alone in the town's eyes, but now his isolation felt sharpened, made deliberate. It was not long before tension began to harden. One morning, Garrett found a scrap of paper tucked under the latch of his front gate. The message, scrawled in a rough hand, read, "Stop this before it's too late." Another day he rode out to mend a section of north fence and found a crude symbol slashed into one of the posts, something meant to warn or intimidate. He stood there for a long time under the empty sky, hat pulled low against the wind, and felt anger flare beneath his unease. He had not asked for this, yet the land had spoken, and men feared its voice. Yet not everyone came with malice. On a cool spring afternoon, a wagon appeared from the direction of the railroad town, carrying a small group of freedmen and their children. They had heard about the discovery, one of the men explained softly, and wished to stand on the soil where their ancestors might have passed. Garrett said little, but he let them walk to the far field. He stood apart, leaning against a fence post, as they knelt in the grass and pressed their hands to the earth. Some wept quietly. Others sang a low, steady hymn that drifted on the breeze like a prayer. The sound pierced Garrett in a way he could not name. He thought of the shackles on his table and the letters written by trembling hands, and for the first time felt not just the burden of history, but the fierce, living grief of those to whom it belonged. Days later, a young black preacher arrived on horseback, his coat dustied and his Bible tied to the saddle. He thanked Garrett solemnly for keeping the artifacts safe and spoke of the duty to remember, to build a marker or a chapel so that the story would not vanish again. Behind him came a wiry man from the East, a historian who carried stacks of papers and spoke of museums, preservation, and funding. They both, in their different ways, pressed Garrett to think beyond his ranch. They promised support, even money, if he would allow the land to become a place of memory. The preacher said it was holy ground now. The historian said it was invaluable. Garrett listened, arms crossed, heart twisting. Their words made sense, but they spoke as if the land were already theirs to interpret. He returned to his chores with a heavier step each day. The ranch that had always been his refuge felt invaded, its silence broken by arguments he had never wanted to hear. His debts gnawed at him, and the offers the visitors hinted at. Funds to protect the site, donations to aid the keeper of this history, would have eased his burden. The banker in town would stop sending threatening notes if he could bring a lump sum to pay off what he owed. But each time Garrett pictured signing away the field, allowing strangers to claim the soil where his father's boots had pressed for 50 years, something inside him recoiled. He had promised himself long ago that he would never let go of the ranch until it was pried from him. To sell now, no matter how noble the cause, felt like betraying not only his father, but his own fight to hold on. Sleep became harder. He would wake in the dark, heart pounding, after dreams of riders with torches, of chains clinking in the night, of faceless crowds trampling his pasture. Sometimes he dreamed of his father standing at the edge of the north field, silent, expression unreadable. Was the old man angry that Garrett had disturbed what he left buried, or proud that his son had faced the truth? Garrett could not know. The uncertainty gnawed at him. The town grew more divided as news of the chest spread beyond the county. A larger paper from the east sent a correspondent who arrived with a notebook and a photographer. They visited the field, took pictures, and published an article about a forgotten station on the road to freedom. The story traveled fast. Soon more wagons came, more riders, some gentle, some insistent. A few groups camped overnight near his fences, singing or praying in the dark. Others shouted questions from the road when Garrett refused them entry. He tried to go on with his work mending tack, tending cattle, but each knock on his door, each stranger by his fence, reminded him that his life was no longer private. One evening, returning from town with salt and grain, he found another message nailed to his front post. Leave the past where it belongs. The letters were gouged deep into the wood. He stood staring at it until dusk bled into night, fury rising like fire in his chest. He thought of tearing it down, of riding into town to confront whoever had left it. But instead, he turned back to the house, silent and tight-jawed, fear and anger tangled together inside him. He had been alone his whole life and content enough, but now he felt hunted, judged by neighbors and strangers alike. And yet the same week, another wagon of freed families came, this time bringing flowers and small tokens to lay on the disturbed earth. Children walked barefoot into the field, kneeling to press their palms against the soil, whispering as though to spirits they could feel. Garrett watched from a distance, leaning on his fence. Something inside him softened, even as the weight of it all threatened to crush him. He was not sure he wanted to be a symbol, but he could not ignore the faces of those who found solace here. Spring turned to early summer. The prairie baked under a relentless sun, and the grass turned brittle and gold. Garrett's days became a pattern of interrupted work and uninvited conversations. Preachers spoke to him about legacy. Scholars sent letters offering payment for the chest or for the right to document his land. A businessman from the railroad even stopped by, proposing to buy the northern section and build a formal memorial funded by donors. Each brought promises of relief, money enough to pay the bank and fix the barn, to grow old without fear of foreclosure. But the unspoken cost was clear. The land would no longer truly be his. Once he sold or signed, strangers would own not just the history, but the ground itself. He felt torn between two lives. One was the life he had always known, hard, solitary, tied to the cycles of cattle and grass and debt. The other was a life he could barely imagine, where his ranch became a place of pilgrimage and learning, where he was no longer a rancher, but a caretaker of memory. Some nights, he paced the floor, lantern swinging, trying to picture himself free of his struggles, but bound to an entirely new identity. Other nights, he sat on the porch, staring at the dark fields and feeling a fierce, almost stubborn love for the soil his father had broken. The pressures mounted not only from outsiders, but from within. His own conscience began to whisper that he had been chosen, somehow, to give voice to what the earth had hidden. The shackles and the letters demanded remembrance. And yet another voice, quieter but strong, warned that surrendering his land might mean losing the last piece of himself that felt solid. By midsummer, the conflict had grown into something like a storm inside him. He moved through his chores by rote, his thoughts consumed by what to do. Debt collectors pressed harder, neighbors muttered more openly, and still the visitors came. Black families in quiet gratitude, white churchmen speaking of redemption, academics taking notes for books they would write. Garrett began to feel less like a man and more like a battleground for forces larger than he could grasp. One night, unable to sleep, he saddled his mare and rode out to the north field under a sky full of stars. The land stretched silver in the moonlight, quiet except for the sigh of the wind through the dry grass. He stopped where the chest had first broken the surface and sat there for a long time, hat in his lap, staring at the disturbed earth. He thought of his father's voice telling him the land remembers. He thought of Mary, who had always believed that truth mattered even when it hurt. He thought of his sons, so far away, who would not care if the ranch became a monument or was sold to pay a debt. And he thought of the nameless people who had once hidden here, running for their lives toward a freedom most never reached. For the first time since this began, Garrett spoke aloud, though only to the night. His voice was rough and halting as he admitted his fear, not just of losing the ranch, but of failing to honor what had been entrusted to him. He did not know what the right path was, but he knew one thing with certainty. He could not simply bury the chest again and pretend none of it had happened. The truth had been dug up. and it would not go quietly back into the dark. When dawn came, he was still there, watching the first light gild the empty field. He felt a grim kind of resolve settling in his bones, though the shape of his decision was not yet clear. The land had spoken, and whatever came next, he would have to answer. When the long summer waned and the nights grew cool again, Garrett Johnson finally understood what he had to do. The decision had not come as a sudden revelation, but as a slow, relentless tide. For months, he had lived between two worlds, caught between the quiet life he had fought to keep and the powerful, uninvited truth that had risen from his own soil. He had walked the boundaries of his ranch until the grass was worn flat beneath his boots, ridden endless miles under moonlight, and wrestled alone with fear, anger, and duty. He had listened to strangers plead for history, endured neighbors' resentment, felt the pull of money and the ache of debt, and still the land whispered the same simple demand: remember. In the end, it was not the voices of preachers or scholars that swayed him. It was the memory of his father, the long echo of that quiet lesson, "This earth remembers," and the faces of those who had come to weep and pray on ground that had once hidden their ancestors. Garrett realized that keeping the land meant more than survival now. It meant stewardship. The morning he chose his path broke clear and cold, the kind of autumn dawn that turns the prairie to silver and gold. He rose before first light, fed the horses, and brewed a pot of coffee strong enough to brace his resolve. On the kitchen table lay the chest, its wood dark and scarred but sturdy despite the years. He touched it once, feeling the rough grain under his calloused fingers, then closed the lid and secured it with the same rusty hasp he had pried open months before. He did not intend to hide it again, but he would move it to a place of honor rather than leave it as a curiosity for strangers to paw over. He spent that day working like a man possessed. From the shed, he dragged planks of weathered pine, and the few tools still sharp enough to use. He marked a spot near the edge of the north field, where the prairie opened wide, and the sky seemed to stretch forever. There, on a slight rise that caught the morning sun, he began to build. His hands were steady as he drove posts deep into the ground, his shoulders burning as he raised a simple frame. He was no carpenter, but decades of mending barns and fences had taught him enough. By nightfall, a rough but dignified structure stood over the place where the chest had been buried, a small open shelter with a sloped roof to guard against rain, and a platform sturdy enough to bear the weight of history. In its center, he set the chest and covered it with a canvas cloth, heavy enough to keep out weather, but easy for a visitor to draw back. Above it, he hung a lantern bracket to hold light in the dark evenings. The next day he returned with a tall post and a wide plank planed smooth. Using a heated iron brand, the same one he had used on his cattle, he burned words carefully into the wood. They were not fancy, just simple truth. Here hid those who sought freedom. May their courage be remembered. It took hours of patient work, the smell of scorched pine thick in the cool air. When he was finished, he planted the sign in the earth, tamping the soil firm around it until it stood unwavering against the wind. Then he built a rough bench from spare boards and placed it facing the sign, a spot for any who might come to sit and reckon with the past. For several days after the work was done, Garrett felt an unfamiliar peace settle over him. The north field no longer seemed wounded, but consecrated. He visited each morning, lantern in hand if the dawn was dark, and stood quietly before the sign. He did not pray, but he felt the same solemnity he imagined men felt in church. The shackles and papers remained in the chest, safe but not hidden. Anyone who came could see them, but they were no longer trophies for strangers. They were guarded by the land's rightful keeper. News of what he had done traveled quickly. The next time a wagon of freed families arrived, they found not an exposed hole and an anxious man, but a simple memorial standing silent against the sky. They gathered around it with tears and song, some kneeling to touch the rough letters, others leaving flowers and small carved tokens. A woman pressed Garrett's hands between hers, eyes shining, though he said nothing in return. He had never needed words. The preacher who had first visited returned weeks later and stood long before the sign, hat over his heart. When he turned to Garrett, there was gratitude in his gaze, but also respect for the quiet defiance the old rancher carried. The scholar sent a letter asking to catalog the site formally. Garrett wrote back in his clumsy hand that he would allow documentation but not sale. The land stayed his. Not everyone approved. Some neighbors muttered that he had turned his ranch into a spectacle, inviting strangers and trouble. A few tried to warn him that outsiders would keep coming now, that the attention would bring thieves or worse. One night someone left a dead crow on the fence post, a silent threat meant to unnerve. Garrett found it in the morning, stared for a long moment, then tossed it into the scrub and mended the fence as if nothing had happened. Fear no longer ruled him. He had faced the worst storm already, the loss of his private life, the burden of memory. Compared to that, intimidation felt small. Over time, the hostility cooled. The banker stopped pressing so hard once Garrett paid down a portion of his debt, helped by the modest donations some visitors insisted on leaving. It was not enough to make him rich or free from worry, but it bought him breathing room. More importantly, it meant the ranch would not be seized or sold. The men who had once scoffed began to regard him with grudging respect, if not friendship. They could see he had not handed the land to outsiders. He had kept it, standing firm in a way most had doubted he could. Even those who preferred silence grew quieter in their objections, unwilling to challenge a man who had weathered so much alone. As autumn deepened, the memorial became a quiet place of pilgrimage. Travelers arrived by horse, by wagon, sometimes on foot. They were not the noisy reporters of the first months, but families seeking connection, teachers with small groups of children, black preachers bringing congregants to honor their forebears. They came respectfully, left offerings or prayers, and departed with solemn faces. Garrett learned to nod in greeting and then step back, giving them space. He rarely spoke, but always watched to ensure the chest was treated with care. In his silence, visitors seemed to understand that the land itself was speaking louder than any man could. His own life slowly returned to a rhythm, though not the one he had known before. Each morning he tended his cattle and repaired what needed fixing, but there was no longer the dull despair that had once haunted his work. The debt was still there, the fences still broke, the barn still leaned under the weight of years. Yet Garrett moved with a steadiness born of purpose. He was no longer merely a man clinging to a fading way of life. He was the steward of a story greater than himself. When he passed the memorial, he tipped his hat as he might to a grave, and the act filled him with quiet strength. Sometimes at dusk, after the last chores were done, he sat on the bench facing the sign and watched the prairie darken under a wash of red and purple sky. Coyotes would call in the distance, and the wind would ripple through the dry grass like the breath of unseen travelers. In those moments, he thought of the ones who had hidden here, terrified yet brave enough to keep moving north. He thought of Mary, who would have understood why he had chosen this path, and of his sons, who might one day read of their father's stand and see more than just an old rancher struggling against failure. He thought of his father, too, silent and stern, and wondered if somewhere the old man was nodding in approval. Garrett hoped so. Winter arrived with hard winds and brittle nights. The work grew more grueling as he hauled water through ice and fed hay to thin cattle. But even in the hardest days, he carried the knowledge that his land now bore witness. When the first snow came and blanketed the prairie, he trudged to the memorial and cleared the drifted white from the sign and the roof of the little shelter. He lit the lantern there and watched its glow spill warm across the snow, a beacon in the cold. It felt right, as if the light was for all who had once sought refuge here. Letters continued to arrive from faraway cities, thanks from descendants who had read of the site, requests to visit, offers of help. Garrett answered some, ignored others, always careful to keep the land from slipping into hands that would claim it. He did not need a foundation or a museum. He needed to preserve what the earth had revealed. It was enough for him to be the quiet guardian. In the rare evenings when the town felt safe enough for him to visit the saloon, men sometimes tried to draw him into conversation. A few clapped him on the back and said he'd done something fine, even if they hadn't liked it at first. Others simply nodded, eyes lowered, unwilling to admit respect, but no longer hostile. Garrett accepted their silence as its own kind of peace. He had no desire for fame or praise. He had only wanted to survive. Now he understood that survival could mean more than keeping one's land. It could mean giving it meaning. The seasons rolled on. Grass returned green in spring. Calves wobbled on new legs, and visitors still came, though fewer than before. The frenzy had passed. What remained was a quiet, steady stream of those who cared. Garrett kept the memorial tidy, repaired its roof when storms tore at the shingles, and relit the lantern whenever wind or rain extinguished it. He began to think of it not as a burden, but as part of the ranch itself, as natural as the well or the barn. The field had once been a place his father feared or ignored. Now it was the ranch's heart. One evening, after finishing his rounds, Garrett paused halfway back to the house and looked across the prairie. The setting sun burned copper on the horizon, and the sign in the north field stood dark against the fiery sky. The lantern had already been lit by some visitor earlier in the day and glowed faintly in the growing dusk. Garrett felt something swell in his chest, not pride exactly, but a deep, abiding peace. For so long he had fought simply not to lose what was his. Now he understood he had gained something far greater, a purpose rooted deeper than debt or survival. He sat that night by the hearth with a rare sense of contentment. The ranch was still his, but no longer just his. It held the weight of forgotten lives, the courage of those who had crossed it in fear and hope. It told a story now, and he was its keeper. The world might move on, railroads might stretch farther, his sons might never return, but this ground would speak long after he was gone. As sleep finally came, Garrett dreamed not of debts or storms, but of the open prairie under moonlight. He saw travelers moving silently across it, chains broken, faces turned north, and behind them, his own weathered house standing with its lantern burning like a beacon. He dreamed of a land that remembered, and of a man who had listened. When morning came, the dream lingered, gentle and sure. Garrett rose, pulled on his boots, and stepped into the pale dawn. The air was sharp, and the sky endless. He saddled his horse and rode toward the memorial. The familiar creak of leather and crunch of frost beneath hooves steadying his heart. As he approached, the sign came into view, stark and simple against the rising light. He touched the brim of his hat and sat for a moment, looking out over the field. The ranch was still fighting weather and time, still humble and hard, but it was alive with meaning now. And Garrett Johnson, once only a weary rancher clinging to survival, rode on knowing he had become something more, a witness, a protector, and the quiet keeper of a story the land itself had trusted him to tell. Don't let this story end here. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next powerful journey into the past. take a moment to watch the other stories waiting for you right now. There are more you won't want to miss. And if this story moved you, share it with friends and family so they can be part of the conversation too.